net and comparing it to other treatments as well for refugee populations. No other model has done as much research with refugees. EMDR now has some small sample sizes, and I imagine it would work as well. I don't see why it wouldn't. This is work that has taken place, as I was saying earlier, all over the world now. So it's to a point where there aren't randomized controlled trials anymore with NET because it's really been documented to work. What there is now is NET with other sort of comorbidities like bipolar and schizophrenia and other vulnerable. Does that make sense? Because you don't just keep repeating the same thing. So I want to back up and say one thing. So how did I become involved with this group? So I came to Minnesota in 2001, and 2 weeks later, 9/11 happened. And Pauline Boss was a colleague there at the time. And Pauline said, "Can you come to New York?" And I was really quite terrified. I mean, I had never at that point, even though I had already had this sort of ambition to work with trauma-affected populations, I didn't have any training. So I went and I supported Pauline. Of course, she was amazing, and we did a lot of work together that I think was important with and using family therapy as a base. But I knew that summer I looked for who's doing who's doing the best work around the world in this area, and I learned about Vivo and went for that week-long training. And it was like instant love and partnership because I needed this piece that I didn't have training, but they said, "You know what, we think this works." Those were early days of their work. They said, "We think this works, but what do we do with the families? What do we do with disrupted relationships? What do we do with the community?" And so we early on developed this partnership that actually has worked out. I've joined them now on several other projects looking at the family side. How do you support parents in the aftermath of traumatic stress? So the idea being here that this model of, violence breeds violence, poor parenting practices, many of us know this, even things that we never want to do, maybe were done to us. If we don't learn different ways, we find ourselves doing the same thing. So that's the idea. Can we, in the context of war and violence, is there a similar pattern? So this first question, to all these questions, we now actually have more answers. Yes, there is a similar pattern. We're getting evidence from many different parts of the world that families are really struggling and children are struggling and becoming more highly suicidal and like hard things going on in these communities. Escalation of substance use, violence in the home. So does psychopathology, things like PTSD and depression, have a moderating role in the transmission of violence? Yes, we're seeing more evidence of this now. Like in the last decade, some big advances have been made. And can positive parenting buff for some of this? So we have I think for most of us who are systemic thinkers, it's like, yeah, of course this would work. But we have early stage evidence of some of this, okay? And I am proud to say that some of the work that I did in Uganda, the very small feasibility study is one of the first to document that type of buffering effect. But it's a small study, so. So a little more now about just a very brief review on, so what is post-traumatic stress? Because it's also been, I think it's a good thing that trauma is more like in the popular language, but it's also really highly misused. Like people talk about, just anything now being traumatic, don't we all hear that all the time? And it's actually it's not the case that anything, there are very deep, some of the biggest losses that we may have in life aren't necessarily traumatic. Okay, so it's important to distinguish the difference. So in order for a trauma, at least the way DSM, it could be that in 10 years it's conceptualized differently. I mean, there were some changes to DSM-5 already. But you need to have, the first criteria is you have to have what is classified as a traumatic event. And so here it has to be a direct experience or witnessing of something that is threatening, horrifying, you feel helpless, you think you're gonna die, you think the threat level has to be there. Okay, so this is the main feature of what then might be considered traumatic. You can't get it through TV unless you think there's something else going on and you think that is a direct threat. But then we're talking about another type of mental health situation. So we know that fear has a protective factor. It keeps us alive, and the brain goes into the amygdala in particular, also referred to as the reptilian brain, is there to keep us alive. And we know that there's this cascade of things that happen when we are exposed to fear. Most types, we can fight it, we can leave it, we can do something about, but there are some fears that don't then get stored in the brain in a way where there's a resolution. So for now, I only want to mention again a couple things. So the amygdala is what makes you immediately freeze, and then you assess what's going to happen, and your body will, I'm going to forward this real quick, our body then goes into this alarm response where you have the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems go on. And for those of us working with traumatic stress, this is actually really important to know, because it provides us cues for how to do exposure and to know how people reacted at the time that they were experiencing the event. So if you had a fuller training, we would talk all about what does this look like. But I'm going back here again. But so the amygdala serves this main function, and it is referred to as the hot memory. And the hot memory is comprised of cognitive, so what was I thinking at the time? Did I think I could escape? Did I think I was going to die? What are the feelings associated with it? What is the sensory experience, and what is the physiological experience? Some of you may know that sometimes the body doesn't need certain parts to function in those systems, and so sometimes people, urinate, people throw up, many things like this happen that can be really threatening to people's sense of dignity and self, and they avoid situations, but even therapy, because they immediately know that they might throw up. So who wants to, right? So this is where the psychoeducation becomes critical, because you can help to normalize and explain, and then you can also say to them, no matter how terrible it is, I'm going to be here with you, and if you need to throw up, we'll bring the bucket, and if you need to, right? So these are ways that you help to restore people's dignity, which is so profound, and so profound for people on the other side to hear that you understand and it's going to be okay. The hippocampus is, I kind of think about it as a filing system for the brain. So this is where context is stored. And then together, the amygdala and the hippocampus, hot and cold memory, inform the prefrontal cortex. And so here is executive functioning, emotional regulation. And this is part of, for me as my specific research isn't on that, it's on parenting interventions, right? So how do I teach a parent who's struggling with post-traumatic stress to do emotional regulation with their 3-year-old if they're having PTSD? So really critically important for us to have that information in terms of adapting the intervention. And it remains an empirical question whether, if you have PTSD, can you go straight to parenting intervention? Or do you need to, and even though it remains an empirical question, this is the next study that I hope to be able to do, is to look at this question. But I would say that it probably depends on level of post-traumatic stress. Whether you need to have that treatment first and then have the parenting work. Because you need to have the capacity for any kind of parenting work, you need to have the capacity to do emotional regulation. I included this here mostly because this is an incredible article that proposes an expanded cascade of what happens for people exposed to traumatic events, and gives specific details of how you could modulate for, if people were just when you're working with exposure, people who were on the first wave, the 1, 2, 3, up to 4 stage, they are very high aroused. And so they can barely sit on the chair. They are jumping, they are dissociating, right? And you need to find strategies to calm them down so they can sit through the exposure. If people are on the other side, Typically, and there are specific types of situations, like oftentimes people who know they can't escape, maybe they have a knife point to them, they were captive, they were tortured. In these situations, people tend to, you're on the other side, and you have to activate the system because they are going to be prone to wanting to like collapse, to faint. And again, you see, you're connecting to why this knowledge is so important in terms of treatment. I already talked about these areas of the brain. The key thing here is to know, I think, to know this. In the brain of persons with post-traumatic stress, the amygdala is like turned on and turned on high. And that's functional at the time of the stressor, but not when it continues to stay on. And we know what it does in terms of releasing all kinds of hormones that are detrimental to the body if it's always happening. So the amygdala is turned on high and doesn't calibrate back to where it needs to be. And the hippocampus volume is reduced. So there is some debate, question about are people who develop PTSD have smaller hippocampus to begin with, or does it diminish because of traumatic events? There's maybe some evidence on both sides. I can't speak to that, but that's sort of a question that's there. What we do see, there's a great study of the German colleagues. We do see that after NET treatment, the amygdala, both things are changing in this direction. Hippocampus is restored. People are able to be exposed to neutral, positive and negative stimuli and be able to stick with it longer. So it's doing what it needs to do. And I have referenced those references. I didn't include it here, but if some of you are interested, I'm happy to share. I've talked about this, but implications for treatment now, as I've been saying, is you want to integrate these parts of the memory. This is just a simple graph that for some of us, or at least for me, it took some years before I could become more fluent in this language. So any way we can find to keep intact, like keep associating, okay, hot memory, these are the things that are going on, cold memory, filing system. So this is an example, for example, what's happening. We don't remember every day of our lives, right? We remember content that has some kind of elevated, typically emotional or cognitive content. So we remember, most of us remember a first kiss, a first time riding a bike, right? Like positive events like this. And if we asked you to narrate those things, we could, in exposure, actually approximate a lot of what you might have experienced during those times. But here's the idea. In a brain without post-traumatic stress, here, this example, in the hippocampus, I know that I was, at the time, I was around 7, 6, I don't know, going to kindergarten. I was living in New York, and we had just had lunch, and then I went to school. So I have this part of the brain, and it's associated with, it was a blue bike, and I could see the homes behind me, and I could feel the wind in my hair, right? Sensory things. And I know that my thoughts at the time maybe were, I can really do this. I'm riding on it. But maybe there's joy, but there's some fear maybe associated with that first time riding the bike, excitement. And I might have a sense that my heart is beating fast, and maybe I'm sweating, and I'm trembling a bit. So you get this picture, right? This is essentially what exposure means. And here, these parts are connected. In this other example, it's disconnected. So here, I lose track that at the time when whatever happened, I was living in Mogadishu, it happened during the afternoon. Before that, I had been at school. Here, maybe this is an attack of a soldier coming into the home. And I won't go through the whole thing, but you get the picture. What is so really sad about post-traumatic stress as well is that any one of these areas can be a trigger for the entire alarm system to come up. And so I could be walking and I see that particular type of green carpet that I saw that happened back then, and immediately I lose sense that I'm here and now, and I think I'm back. And so this is what I meant by being hijacked by a very difficult condition. right? And you lose track. I'm going to go back to this. Oh, I want to say something else also. Even joyful experiences, physiological and joyful experiences, so love, any kind of like strong emotion can also be a trigger, which is part of why you also see people isolating and not doing the things that they used to love to do. You could walk up a flight of stairs and get a heartbeat, and that can be enough of a trigger, right? So this is simply showing that some stress, like if you're prepared for an exam and you feel ready to go, that kind of stress, adrenaline, and is good. But then there's this point where it tips over and you lose, and this is the fragmentation part. If the stressor overcomes you, overseeds your capacity to hold it, this is the fragmentation part in the brain, and this is where you lose touch between cold and hot memories. I'm going to check time again just to make sure. Okay, I'm going to wrap up this part. So I'm not, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the other symptoms associated with PTSD because I think I've talked about that piece enough, but the information is here, okay? But essentially they are intrusion symptoms. This is according to the revision in DSM-5. Avoidance symptoms. Alterations in cognition and mood. Remember, if your frontal lobe isn't getting the information it needs, it can't do higher order executive functioning. And arousal and reactivity symptoms. And then there are other things that have to do with, how long, duration, and then how much does it disrupt your life, functioning types of questions. So again, this is the brain, you see the X's, the brain is not getting access. The goal then of NET, whoopsie, sorry, I didn't know this was all, okay. The procedure, this is an actual photo, like in Uganda doing the procedure. As long as you have a confidential area, you can do it anywhere. But the procedure uses a rope. As long as the symbols aren't themselves triggers or reminders of something else, you can start with a rope to symbolize life from beginning to present and the unfolding future, and flowers and stones, flowers for positive, particularly positive events, and stones for negative events. There are some variations, again, like American Indian communities often see stones as positive, and so we would switch it out. Sometimes people ask, so why flowers? Why talk about that? For so many of the people we work with, you have to actually dig for flowers. It's really hard to find flowers. And so if the idea is to construct an entire autobiography that is not fragmented, you also want to be able to integrate. So we don't do exposure on the flowers, but it's part of their entire narrative. And this is, I wish I could show you examples of actual narratives, but because for clinicians, it's really important to see wow, by 13, I sometimes show one, by 13 years old, I've already have been forced to murder people, and I have had to sit on bodies, and I've had to, in some parts of the world, there's cannibalism. So it's just really very difficult, horrifying, and a whole spectrum. Of course, childhood sexual abuse is very hard, but it gives you a sense as a therapist. The question is, can I hear these stories? Because remember, it's going to be like a movie, and you're going to have that story in your head, like a slow motion movie even, right, where everything is really slowed down. So amazing, and I think most of us who do this work, we can do it because we get more reward from being able to be a witness and be a partner in some ways with a person who has the courage to tell the story. But it does stick in your head for a while. So you also have to have a lot of self-care techniques to be able to do this work. So, of course, briefly, the procedure, it starts with the interview. You do the lifeline, which, by the way, is a beautiful tool that can be used outside of PTSD with other kinds of therapies. And then you go in through the sessions as they were described and laid out. And it ends with You have, for the therapist, you're writing the entire narratives. You end by, if they want to keep the document, you reread the entire autobiography, and either you keep it safe in your files or you give it to them. A lot of the populations we work with are not literate, but they want it because they want to document what's happened to them. And for them, it becomes very symbolic in terms of passing it on to other generations. So there are a lot of different ways that people want to deal with it. So a few things that you never want to do. You definitely don't want to stop at that. When you think about like a bell curve and the hottest part of the exposure, you don't want to stop at the worst part of their experiences, because what you do then is you train the brain, you reinforce the mechanisms in the brain of, I can't hear this, I can't talk about this. But you have to also then have some good training to know what that looks like and how do you actually get them down to a place where they're here experiencing things in the here and now. And you don't want, of course, dissociation or derealization to happen. Every now and then it can slip, but there are ways to address it as well. Okay. Like I said, this is the net part is a 3-day training, and even that is rushed, and so I have to just live with going through things here fast. Of course, a big question for the therapist is am I cut out for this kind of work? And I think sometimes it's hard to tell until you're in it, until you do it, right? So, yeah. Okay, so I said my research isn't on that, but because I work with populations exposed to traumatic stress, I need to know that work. And for the past 9 years, I've had a contract with the Department of Health in Minnesota, mental health, to train minority therapists, therapists of color and refugee therapists to work with their own communities. I have to say, of all the work that I do, that might be one of the most rewarding things I do. So this is the impetus for every year, and approximately in August. So I've trained over 150 refugee and persons of color to work with their own, right? It feels really, really amazing. And now these are people who are also like directors of ORR and different, so they really are, after some years, you start to see the benefits of people with this kind of knowledge being into the community. Okay, so I'm sharing with you the example of my work now in Uganda, because it is where I've been able to complete the feasibility study, and I'm at this very delicate time in my career. So like this is 12, 14 years into this, developing this kind of work. It takes forever, moving these parallel fronts. So I don't want to discourage you, but that's what it's meant for me. But now it's at this delicate stage, because now I've done the feasibility studies, I've published there in international context and in the US, and now it's time to submit grants for the RCTs. And so it's going to happen or not in the next couple of years. And so it's going to happen, but it's going to happen also with the help of people like you. So this is an example. Now I started out by sharing with you how one of the biggest sort of heaviness for me is, what business do I have going to Uganda? I mean, there's a part of me that just loves the world and people and travel, but I have to be really clear. Is it that? Because I can go as a tourist, right? Is that the motivating factor? Or do I really think that as a scientist, as a family therapist, I have something that a potential contribution to make here? And I have to be so careful not to perpetuate a colonizing ideology of taking outside interventions into this world. I can't answer that. Right? But I continuously share the concerns, and then form very strong partnerships in the community, so that one, they can be vetting the situation and me, but also so that there's a sustainability sort of plan. I'm going to look at time again. It's just, yeah, okay. So Uganda is a context of 20 plus years of war. In 2005, Coney went into hiding. He's still alive, so they live with the ongoing fear that he could come back. But for doing this kind of work, because my German colleagues had been there for many years, there was trust. Vivo has, which stands for Victim's Voice, it's the NGO. They have a compound there. So the setting was really ideal for being able to do a first feasibility study in that context. So something else here that has implications for parenting, this last bullet. So part of how this war happened is that Coney abducted children from schools, and this is how he fought the wars. And so you can imagine the implications for the community. And the parents I'm working with now, you'll see photos, many, if not most, were abducted at least once, if not more times, but maybe some were soldiers as well. Women were also fighting, not just as sex and caring porters, but they were also fighting. They were my first net clients, and this is how I got my training, was in that context, but then also they are the parents that now I'm have been working with. And the idea here is, can we do a first feasibility study with these parents? So in 2010, okay, I'll get there in a minute. So we have, the literature is now documenting, well supported in documenting the adverse implications of course, war for parenting and for communities. I'm not gonna say more about that. Not a good thing for children when parents are exposed to post-traumatic stress and to depression. This we also know is very well documented. Looking at in what ways can parenting buffer some of those effects. And I've used specific intervention, theoretical models based on social interaction and coercion, and a host of other things, right? An ecological framework, attachment. For me, always feminist ideology as well. So, I have to say, having been a family therapist, I don't think I could have adapted the existing PMTO, evidence-based intervention. I've adapted it quite a bit to integrate family therapy, particularly experiential approaches into it. So that could be like a whole talk in itself, like what went into adapting it. But these were some of the main frameworks. I always use a cultural adaptation model as well. Some of you may be familiar with Bernal's work. So I find it a really great frame for holding some of those levels of complexity. It's not enough, but it is at least a starting frame. And I want to share with you that, well, this is also probably information you know. My goal is not to only now in this stage, not only to propose RCTs, but to propose hybrid models where you're also in parallel testing dissemination and implementation strategies. And I think this is particularly important in these communities where, it takes so long to do this anyway, but how do you already go into the field thinking about what you're gonna leave behind? How many of you have been exposed to this, like Curran's work on hybrid models of doing research? So this it's like the cutting edge thing, and there aren't so many studies talking about this, but I think really important. We have a lot to learn in that area. So I started in 2010. I thought I can't come unless I know that I potentially have something to offer, that I can sit, that people will engage with me, even though I think I look brown. They see me as a white woman, and they call me Muzungu, they call me an outsider, which is a whole other sort of experience. I learned that in fact there was some reason to think that I could go back and do something. So I'm gonna just fast forward through some of these slides. But Gulu and the surrounding areas is where I started that early sort of, I took a sabbatical and I spent 3 months in the field. And so typical country roads, sometimes driving 2-3 hours to get to some of the villages, some of the schools that we were working in, with a team, of course, of interpreters and local people. Coming to villages and everybody running up to you and wanting to talk. Confidentiality gets really tricky. I shared with you that I grew up in the Amazon, right? So this was like home for me. It was no big deal. I love it. I think I thrive actually in this context more than in this context. Talked to fathers, and the big message of fathers was, actually I'm gonna say this about men. So mortality rates in this part of the country are 35 years old for men, 38 for women. It's rare to see an older person. A lot of it is because substance use. They're cooking their own brew, and it's poisonous to the system. So, but men, some men, like I think 12 men showed up for this one meeting in the school. It's a community that was doing a little better, and men said, please don't forget about us. Like we also, like we need help. Like people go to women, NGOs go to women. So Chris Mayhews, who was an MFP fellow, did his doctoral dissertation with men looking at father roles and the role of alcohol. So we hope to integrate in this next wave men into our groups. We also talked to, like, so how does information, how is there activism happening? Women are being big time, amazing activists. This group of women go around different villages telling people about post-traumatic stress, about like different types of information and issues that are going on. And we go back and work with these women. They're enacting here different types of things. And so intervention here, broadly speaking, can be done through resources like this, right? This was one of the best days of my life, I think, spending 3 hours having them enact to us what they're doing in these different communities. I won't show you the video, but this is me doing one of the focus groups. So, yeah, we learned from the focus groups. We thought that there was enough similarity in terms of what a parenting, like concepts of parenting around praise, discipline, encouragement. So we had some kind of reason to believe, okay, it's not going to be completely different. I have to say discipline is conceptualized very, very differently, but that's one of the challenges we need to take on. I used this lifeline idea to assess kids and parents, because I wanted to know what do they report as the biggest experiences or things happening in their lives. So I'll refer you back to the slides. But that's also a really clever, I think a clever thing to do, to use that as a way to assess. That isn't this form that you yes or no or Likert scale. This is like use your storytelling skills to tell us about your life. And what we found were we talked to parents, did family structured interaction tasks, and we found that indeed, this is hard because I really hesitate to pathologize. You go to a community that has been exposed to war for 20 years, and then you ask them to, in a very artificial way, to talk to a child. Of course they're not gonna sound, right? But it was really hard, the things that we heard them talking about, which gave us evidence that, okay, maybe we can work together in improving some skills. And I took out photos, but you can see the types of ways that they were engaging with kids. Not really having some of those skills. 10? Okay. So I'm gonna try to leave 5 minutes for questions for you at the end, and then this afternoon. Okay. So in 2012, I go back. Actually, Chris and I go back, and we do our first feasibility study. I wanted to do one group. At the first day, we had colleagues there recruiting for us. We had 14 women come. I'm gonna fast forward real quick to, this is our first day. 14 women came and they refused to leave, like they wanted to be a part of this. And so what we did was we developed 2 groups, and I've never read about this anywhere. 9 sessions, they came to every single session. Like incredible. And we were giving them, we can't know for sure what the motivation. I think it had to do much less with us, but about social connection of the women together, for sure. And then if they weren't with us, they would have been at the market, maybe selling something, or they would have been digging. They prefer digging, getting food to sell at the market. So we gave them some beans and rice. So it wasn't like, we had to, of course, make sure that we weren't coercing them in some way. But we had the groups 3 hours at a shot, morning and afternoon. I was sore for the first week of sitting adapting to sitting in this particular way, but really, really tremendous. Remember that here it was about feasibility. So another thing that we did was we hired an artist to take the psychological concepts that are typically written and to draw these, to put everything into a visual. So we were kind of testing, will they use a manual? Now this was really touching. So you get mothers who were abducted and who had to quit school, didn't know how to hold a pencil. We gave them a beautiful little bag with, like the manuals. It was incredible, like the pride that they felt in getting this, like I'm valuable. People cared enough to like depict me in, I'm gonna skip these are the different sessions. I'm gonna go to like some of the depictions that we had. They cared enough to depict me. It was really powerful. Moving forward to the Karen study, we did the same thing, and it was equally really powerful. I know now that this is a step, it's not enough. We're gonna start to make videos, role play videos. So in the next wave, we'll have more. I'm looking for funding. So these are all things that have lots of words to go attached to them, but we try to, this was homework assignments, like coming up with so they would know there was a symbol for how they would track. And I just can't tell you how much pride they felt, I think, in having that kind of interaction. So for feasibility testing, this is great. You need to know, will they come? Will they use the materials? Do they connect to the concepts? Do they try, most importantly, do they try it out with their kids, right? And they did. So I'm gonna sort of be quiet. Well, I guess I can't be. I'm gonna just kind of show you through some things and then